such a warm welcome today. I'm super excited to be here with you to talk about sensitive skin and inflammation, a subject that I am extremely passionate about as I can truly relate to it. I am a sensitive, fair skin that does battle with breakouts and eczema on my skin. Today, we have the opportunity to dive into the subject of inflammation to give us a better understanding of what it is and how, as professional skin therapists, we can manage inflammatory skin disorders like acne, those breakouts, eczema, or even rosacea. We're seeing an increase in sensitivity and inflammation, especially at the moment. Given our current circumstances, our lifestyles are being hugely impacted by the stress of the global pandemic, COVID-19, and lots of you will be experiencing higher stress levels, maybe increased anxiety. And this can all play a role and have an impact on the way our skin behaves. And some of you sitting with me today, feel free to sort of add into the chat box if you're noticing that your own skin is maybe flaring up or you've seen more breakout activity given what we're going through right now. So as part of this webinar today, we want to bust the myths around sensitive skin and we want to really help you deal with those concerns. So we're going to be looking at identifying sensitive skin and the triggers. We're going to be talking a lot about the epidermal barrier and diving into the inflammatory process. So you're going to be learning about immunogenic and neurogenic inflammation and looking at the cells that are involved in this process. And we want you to leave this session today with confidence to have the right treatment approach specifically for a sensitive skin, to be able to give the sound advice on lifestyle factors and maybe products to use or ingredients to look out for to ensure that you can give your clients maximum results. So I'm noticing from the chat box that lots of you are relating to that troublesome skin at the moment, and maskne is real. I definitely agree. So I think it's hugely relevant right now for us to dive in and elevate your knowledge on what's happening in the inflammatory process so that we're well equipped to support our clients, particularly at the moment. So starting off with looking at the definition of a sensitive skin. As you can see here, it's a term used by individuals who consider themselves to be more intolerant of topical preparations and environmental conditions than the general population. This is quite a broad definition, so I want to break it down and bust the myths around sensitive skin and help you manage it better. We like to split sensitivity into two categories. We have a sensitive skin type, and we also have sensitized, which is a skin condition. So first of all, if we look at sensitive as a skin type is genetic. So we are predisposed to having a sensitive skin. You're born with this skin type, and you're usually sensitive all over your body when it's a genetic skin type. You'll often find that the sensitive skin type is usually fair-skinned and of Northern European ancestry. And the skin reacts easily to the things around us. When it comes to looking at identifying whether somebody is a sensitive skin type, one of the things we tap into is the atopic triad, and some of you will be familiar with this. Asthma, eczema, and hay fever make up that atopic triad. And if you suffer with one or more of those conditions, then you generally find you'll fall into being part of that sensitive skin type. Whereas a sensitized skin condition is different. Any skin can become sensitized at any time, regardless of their skin color and genetic background. So skin can become sensitized due to our lifestyle and external factors, which we'll dive in and take a look at in a moment. But what's interesting here is that whether you're talking about a sensitive skin type or whether you're starting to think maybe you've experienced sensitization, that sensitized skin condition, the physical characteristics, so what we see and what we feel on the skin, are the same. So I'd like you to take a moment now to think about a client you've maybe had in the past, or maybe even just think about your own skin. And if you've experienced sensitivity, what do you see? What does it look like and what does it feel like? Share that with me in the chat function so that we can see if anybody is experiencing or knows what it looks and feels like. Absolutely. We often see redness, don't we? That's maybe that blotchiness on the skin, inflammation, heat, hot spots, irritation. Wow, the chat box is on fire. Definitely. Maybe even a cracked skin or a tightness. That tightness indicates dehydration, and all of that redness and blotchiness and irritation is an overactivity of capillary action and makes the skin more reactive. So I think whether you're dealing with a sensitive skin type or whether you've identified this is somebody with a sensitized skin condition, you need to then know how to manage these signs and symptoms. So if you're a sensitive skin type, it will be a case of managing this always. So you need to have a regular cleansing routine that's gentle, being aware of not overly exfoliating, and hydration is key to support your epidermal barrier, as that's fundamental in caring for the skin and having a healthy skin. Whereas if you have a sensitized skin condition, it's more of a short-term thing. Something in your lifestyle has triggered the activity of the sensitization, and you can treat and correct the symptoms in the short term. So let's take a look at some of the triggers that we might want to avoid when it comes to sensitivity. There's lots of things in our lifestyle that can play a part in that sensitivity. Your skin is a reflection of your lifestyle and your environment. So the types of triggers we're exposing to, you can see on the images on the screen here. We have pollution. Excessive exposure to pollutants will sensitize the skin. Lifestyle, there's so many lifestyle factors. We have maybe our diet, eating spicy foods. That's been linked to increase in sensitivity. We have alcohol that dilates the blood vessels. We have long periods of time outdoors in sports or work or camping that will expose your skin to the elements and maybe more UV damage on the skin. So there's varying different things, as you can see from the imagery here, that extreme climate change. When we go from extreme cold outside and then come indoors where we have that heating on and that warmth, that extreme change in temperature means that your skin and your capillary activity has to cope with that, which can lead to varying levels of sensitivity. So we may be inadvertently sensitizing our skin on a daily basis without even realizing it. So it's no surprise that over 50% of the global population are suffering with sensitivity. So as professional skin therapists, we cannot deny that there's a huge amount of clients out there that will need our support. So I now want to start diving into more of the science behind sensitivity. And we know with a sensitive skin, and when you're dealing with sensitive skins, is that somebody might be responsive. They might be having a response on the skin. You might be experiencing that redness. And I think the first thing that we need to understand is our sensitization response. Your skin is continually working hard to protect you against those trigger factors that we've just talked about. And without realizing it, these trigger factors are setting your skin up to have potential reactions in the future. The graph here shows and describes this for you. So along the bottom line, we have time, which represents hours, days, or it could even be years. And at the left-hand side, we have skin reaction. And you can see in the center, we have a dotted line. And this dotted line represents our skin's tolerance threshold. So each of us have a tolerance threshold. Our skin can cope so much with our day-to-day life and our exposure, and then all of a sudden things can be tipped out of balance. you'll see that the dots and the bubbles on the graph represent invisible and visible damage. And it's interesting to learn here that once your skin's tolerance threshold has been reached, this is when you start to see the visible reaction of redness or irritation on the skin. So that day-to-day buildup of exposures will eventually lead to visible damage. And I think when we talk about the invisible reaction maybe taking place continually, we perhaps don't realize it, and maybe things are happening on the skin is getting tighter, it has felt a bit uncomfortable, you did experience some tingling, and maybe we've just ignored it, and that's natural. You can see that the arrows along the bottom here signify the different levels of exposure to a sensitizer, and that can be anything from pollution to a product, an ingredient, bacteria, anything that we're exposing our skin to on a day-to-day basis. I have a great story to share with you actually, just really describes the sensitization response here. I'm a lover of pre-cleanse, and I use it in my routine every single day and have done for many, many years now. And I had a period of my sort of life where I was going through a really stressful time and moving house, and lots of changes were happening for me personally. And all of a sudden, my skin was responding to pre-cleanse and I couldn't use it. My skin was flaring up, my eczema, my eczema was sort of playing up as well. And I think that's a really good example that pre-cleanse isn't bad. It's not a bad ingredient. It's not a bad product. But actually, because of what I was going through personally, my skin had reached its coping threshold. And the pre-cleanse just happened to be what tipped it over the edge. Maybe you can relate to this. Maybe some of you have had an experience with a client in the treatment room. Maybe they come regularly for treatments, and then 1 month they come to visit you and you're exfoliating with an AHA, and a client would normally tolerate on their skin really, really well, but then all of a sudden there's a response. So if you've experienced that, that's an example of maybe a sensitization response taking place. The skin's threshold has been reached and we need to work on calming the skin and repairing the barrier. And I think one of the things to recognize here is that in my circumstances, I didn't have an allergy to pre-cleanse or to an ingredient, but I actually was just having a sensitization response. And I think this is such a huge light bulb moment for lots of people, that we can have an allergy. Any of us can develop an allergy over time, but we can also experience sensitization responses. And I think it's important as a professional skin therapist to try and be able to sort of identify that and see that a sensitization response is where the skin isn't coping right now because the barrier is impaired. So the good news is it doesn't mean that your client won't ever be able to use that product again or have that exfoliation again, but more that we need to read the skin and listen to it speaking to us, and listen to it when it's tingling, and listen to it when it goes red, because that's the skin saying, hang on a minute, I need calming today. And that's where we need to focus on reducing and calming inflammation as our first port of call if we see that on the skin. So we've talked about the sensitivity threshold, and I've mentioned the skin's barrier. And a key player in all of this is inflammation. And I think one of you today has just shared that you often see this kind of sensitization after a client has had a cold or is experiencing flu or taking antibiotics. And I think that's really poignant here, because that's where the immune system's being affected, or it's taking its toll on the immune system. So already your body's working to try and, heal and repair from the colds or the antibiotics. So that's where you start to see that the flare-ups come in. And that leads us nicely into what we want to talk about now, which is understanding the immune system. And the reason that we want to understand the immune system is because inflammation works alongside our immune system. So just take a moment to think about, what does your immune system do for you? Yes, it protects you. Your immune system is there to protect you, fight off intruders, and it's inflammation that plays a role in that immune function. So the role of inflammation is actually a really good thing. It's protecting you and it's defending you from those invaders. And inflammation is going to start the healing process and allow for healing. So we need inflammation. It's a good thing. But we need inflammation that's under control. When it starts to go awry or become chronic, that's when it can start becoming more problematic for our skins. So the immune system and inflammation go hand in hand. And you can see here that I'm sharing with you sort of some of the tissues and organs that make up the immune system on the left image here. And just as we said, think about last time you had a cold, your body is under attack. You may have swollen lymph nodes. I can really relate to that. You know, in the neck area, you can see that's where the lymph nodes are positioned. So your body is already fighting that virus. And then we have the cells on the right-hand image. Today, we're going to be looking at these cells. Yes, we're going to be looking at the white blood cells. We've got different types of cells within our immune system. And we've got white blood cells, basophil cells, eosinophil cells, and they're all involved in defending the body against infectious disease. And one of the cells that we're going to be talking about in particular is the mast cell. And this is one of the cells that's involved in a reaction. So some of you might have experienced an allergy. We've talked today about a sensitization response, but I've also mentioned we can have an allergic response. Some of you might be familiar with that. So if you are having a full-blown allergic response, the mast cell will be involved in that process. So when we look at the immune system, it's amazingly complex, and it's really interesting to be able to understand the complexities of it. So we know that our immune system fights off intruders. Intruders like these guys that you can see on the screen here. These are microbes. These can be viruses, toxins, bacteria, chemicals. And your immune system is extremely clever, and it has the ability to recognize millions of different invaders, and the job is to wipe them all out. Once the immune cells receive the alarm, they activate and produce powerful chemicals. So how exactly does your immune system recognize these intruders? Well, the intruder is also known as an antigen. For antibody generator. And you can see on the image here that the antigens are in yellow. These are the bad agents, the toxins, the foreign materials. Some of you might be able to relate to it being dust pollen or certain types of foods that are capable of triggering an immune response in the body. And the presence of this antigen will induce the production of an antibody. And the antibodies are in blue on the screen. And these are the proteins that the body produces to defend against specific types of antigen. So the antibodies are the warriors. They are the little warriors that are going to fight off those nasty invading particles. So the antibodies are designed to fit with specific antigens, and that is how they destruct. So this illustration helps you visualize how it works. On the end of each antigen, you'll notice there are marker molecules in orange, and these each have specific properties. And those invading microbes come in different shapes and sizes, and you'll see that the antibodies line up perfectly with the antigen like a puzzle piece. The circular markers fit in the rounded slots, and the same with the triangular and the square shapes. Now remember, this is just an illustration for the purposes of today, but it shows you the antibodies in action and how they're specific to different types of antigens that we're exposed to on a day-to-day basis. And this is describing one of the ways in which our specialized cells of the immune system recognize invading microbes. What's interesting here is, over time, the body develops specific antibodies, and they become part of our adaptive immunity. And that's where we want to dive in and have a look at our immune system now in a little bit more detail. So as you can see from the image on the screen here, we have our adaptive immunity and we have our innate immunity. And our adaptive immunity that we've just mentioned develops over our lifetime, and it is more of a precision-guided defense system. it's creating those antibodies to fight against those future invaders. Your adaptive immunity is personal to you because it's unique to whatever you've been exposed to. And I mentioned a few moments ago that we can all develop an allergy over our lifetime. For example, you can develop hay fever. This is an adaptive immune response to a harmless substance, pollen. And the result is that we've developed an allergy to pollen. So this allergic reaction requires the buildup of antibodies to pollen. And you can see on the screen here that the adaptive response is referred to as a slower response. And this is because the body remembers the exposure that you've had previously to pollen, and it now sees it as a culprit. Think of it like the FBI. The immune system now perceives pollen on the most wanted list. And once you expose again to pollen, it recognizes it and it attacks by sending those antibodies from specialized cells. And you can see the cells that sit within the adaptive immunity are known as our B cells and our T cells. And it's the B cells that are called to action. These are your special forces that come in and they attack the intruder. Whereas on the other image, you can see we describe our innate immunity. Your innate immunity comes from within. This you are born with. If you experience an attack that is harmful from a virus or bacteria, it's your innate immunity that comes into action quickly. It attacks any germ and responds really, really quickly. Think of this like an emergency response system, like an ambulance. No matter who the invader is, they are recognized and can be destroyed. And you can see from the image on the slide here that there's different cells involved. We've got the mast cell, we've got the dendritic cells, known as the Langerhans cells. We've got macrophages, which come along and eat all of the invaders. And you can also see from the image that your adaptive and your innate immunity overlap and they're closely connected, and it's very clever because they can communicate with each other as well. So you're starting to see that the immune system and the immune response is quite a complex system. And sometimes as a professional skin therapist, it's very difficult to know or identify exactly what's happening, but you'll be able to recognize when you're having a response that the immune system has been triggered and it's going to set off a cascade of events. And we refer to this cascade of events as immunogenic inflammation. And one of the key cells in this process of immunogenic inflammation is the mast cell. And the mast cell plays a key role in the inflammation. You can see that we mentioned the mast cell is a specialized cell, part of your innate immunity, and it plays a role in our allergies, and it also has a protective function, and it's involved in wound healing and defending against pathogens and bacteria. The mast cell contains histamine granules, and it's histamine that triggers inflammation when it comes to our allergies. And it's when the histamine's released that we start to see symptoms like itching and irritation and pain. So hay fever is an example of a histamine reaction. If you have ever experienced hay fever, you may have taken an antihistamine, and it's the antihistamine that works to block the release of those histamine molecules that are coming from the mast cell to give you the release from that allergy. So I wanted to show you this process in action. And you can see on the screen here in bright green, we have our invading pathogen or allergen. And you can see the mast cell is covered in antibodies. The antigen, which is the one in green, comes in and it binds to the antibody. This triggers the reaction that bursts the mast cell. This releases the little red histamine molecules that trigger the inflammatory process, and it makes nearby capillaries leaky. We get vasodilation, and this results in itching and irritation and inflammation. So this is the cell that's involved in that immunogenic process. Now, there's other cells that are involved within the immune system that are working here, and they all need to be able to communicate with each other. And they communicate via cytokines. Cytokines are the chemical messengers that communicate with all of the different cells. So the mast cells, the B cells, the T cells, all of those are communicating with each other via the cytokines. So imagine that your mast cell and your B and T cells are like the army and the police who are on patrol or available in an emergency. And it's the cytokines that are like the 911 operators. They're the dispatchers that communicate and tell the cells where to go and when. An example of a cytokine is a chemokine, and they direct the white blood cells to the site where they are needed the most. So we've discussed so far the immune system in detail, and we've looked at sort of the immunogenic process and how that triggers the mast cell and how these cells communicate via cytokines. And the thing that is fundamental in all of this is our skin's barrier, because this is where it all begins. And I think if you've got your skin's barrier intact, you're less likely to see an inflammatory response or less likely to see that triggering of the immune system. So just to remind you, I know lots of you will be familiar with the skin's barrier. You've got your skin cells that, when we talk about our barrier, we often reference it as a brick wall, and you can see that from the image here. You've got your skin cells that are your physical bricks. You've got your lipids that are the cement that surround those bricks to help lock in the moisture. And then you've got your natural moisturizing factor, which is the hydration that sits within those skin cells. So it's important that we work on that barrier continually to keep it intact, to have that healthy skin, and especially when it comes to treating a sensitive skin, because they are more susceptible to maybe lacking in those barrier lipids. If they're dehydrated and dry and cracked, as you mentioned at the beginning of the session, they're more likely to see gaps in the barrier. And you can see from the image that when the barrier is compromised and we have those gaps in the barrier, you're more likely to see irritants and bacteria and pollution that can then penetrate into the skin much deeper and much quicker. And so we're more likely to see redness and irritation over time. So as professional skin therapists, it's our job to be, repairing the barrier and educating on how to repair the barrier with hydration and specialized ingredients that will restore the barrier. And I'm going to introduce you to some of those ingredients later on today so that you feel confident with which ingredients and which formulas you should be reaching for to really restore the barrier function. And I think, supporting the barrier is essential in building your skin's tolerance threshold. We talked about a sensitization response, and we talked about that threshold. So working on that barrier and making sure everything's intact will help your skin cope better. It will help support that skin threshold. So I'd like to watch a video now, which is going to take a deep dive into the skin, and it's going to show you what's happening with the cells when we have an inflammatory response. So here you're going to see what happens within the skin when the tissue becomes damaged. And this is hopefully going to really help solidify the immunogenic inflammation that we've been discussing today. So I'd like you to imagine that you are gardening in your garden and you get a thorn in your finger. And this is when the inflammatory process kicks in. And the first stage that we see is the vascular stage. This refers to your blood vessels. During acute inflammation, your blood vessels will, first of all, constrict, but then they will dilate. And they dilate, which means that they widen to increase blood circulation to the area, to allow more oxygen and nutrients to be able to get to the area to start the healing process. And this blood dilation that's taking place within the skin can be seen on the surface as redness, inflammation, pain, and heat, maybe even swelling. And this increases the blood flow, as you can see here on the video. And this means that we're bringing weapons to the area to fight off those microbes. We're releasing those cytokines and we're releasing that histamine, which is all amplifying the inflammatory reaction. And now you can see the cellular stage, and this is where your enemy fighters come in. The white blood cells, the monocytes, are able to squeeze through the leaky membrane of the dilated blood vessel into the process known as emigration. We get a signal telling the monocytes exactly where to go from the cytokines, and this is the process of chemotaxis. Those 911 operators are coming into play and telling the cells to come here and heal and deal with what's going on. And now the macrophages come in and they're able to eat the invading microbes, and this process is seen here as phagocytosis. However, like anything that eats, it also excretes. So you can see here exudates. And this is the pus that forms when your body's been fighting that invader. So next time when you see that pus on the skin, maybe when that breakout's come to a head, this is, you know, that the signal for the beginning of the inflammatory response to end, because the healing's now going to begin. And this process you've seen in action here and sort of we've talked through is the process of immunogenic inflammation. You can see it's a cascade of events with lots of different cells involved and the processes that are taking place. And this is triggered whenever the body is under trauma or injury or any type of inflammation. And like anything in life, when it comes to the process of inflammation, it's about balance. So I think you've probably seen from what I've said so far today is that inflammation is good when it's, you know, designed to protect us, it's designed to defend us and heal and deal with situations. But it needs to be kept in check, because like anything, when things start to go awry, or if we have too much inflammation, then this can have detrimental effects on the skin. So, excuse me. So it's about working out this balance. And to be able to keep things in balance, we have what's known as mediators. Mediators in inflammation work towards either enhancing or stopping inflammation. So as you can see on the screen here, they can either be pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, depending on the circumstances and depending on what we need them to do. And this is how your body is so clever in trying to balance inflammation. But sometimes we do need to help from the outside. And I think that's where we come in as professional skin therapists to really make sure we're helping to support with anti-inflammatory effects on the skin when it's needed. So we've mentioned cytokines. You know, they're a chemical messenger. They can be pro or anti-inflammatory. We know that they signal the activation of inflammation as well as being able to terminate inflammation. Chemokines we've mentioned, they are, you know, signaling the cells to come here. They recruit the monocytes and the neutrophils to the site of infection. And we also have lipid mediators, which I haven't mentioned yet, but these are also chemical messengers. And these also respond in tissue injury. So when we have injury, you've got sort of an irritation at the cell membrane, it releases cytokines, and also lipid mediators will play a role here as well. And you're going to see that here when we look at the cycle of everything that we've discussed. So I suppose it all starts with, you know, the irritation, a chemical or the microbe or virus that's irritating the cell membrane, and that kickstarts the inflammatory process. It kickstarts the mast cell activation. You can see here from the slide that then we get the release of cytokines, which tells the cells where to go. And this also activates our inflammatory mediators. And we see that lipid mediators come into play here. And our lipid mediators activate enzymes. They activate phospholipases. And these phospholipases trigger phospholipids that release arachidonic acid. Now, there's a whole sort of subject around this, and we can talk more on this in one of our other workshops. But, you know, there's then a cascade of events where we see a release of prostaglandins and leukotrienes. And this generates more inflammation via, you know, vasodilation and that blood capillary activity. And this amplifies the inflammatory reaction. So you can see here that this is sort of upsetting the balance between many of the cells involved in inflammation. And I think what I wanted to bring to the forefront here is when you see this cycle of events that takes place, it's also affecting other cells in our body and in our skin. And it's affecting innocent bystander cells. So what I mean by innocent bystander cells are things like our fibroblast cells. And I love our fibroblast cells because we know that they're responsible in making and degrading our collagen and elastin. So we know that's what keeps our skin useful and gives it the bounce back. But what's interesting is when the body's busy warding off this attack, it has an effect on some of its other actions. And one of the things it affects is your fibroblast cells. And it affects your fibroblasts in making those new cells. So you'll see that there's a result in fewer new collagen and elastin fibers are able to be produced. So maybe you can relate to this, where you've seen inflammation or experienced inflammation on the skin. Following that, there can be damage to the skin, and it can also trigger, or you see more premature aging on the skin. And that's because the processes of inflammation is also triggering, maybe the degradation or, affecting the production of collagen and elastin. So if you, you're starting to see here that inflammation is complex, but it has a domino effect on other cells in our skin. And if that's left untreated or inflammation becomes chronic, you will start to see further tissue damage. So our key sort of point here is that we want to, as a professional skin therapist, make sure we're reducing and calming inflammation first and foremost. So we've discussed immunogenic inflammation in detail, and we're seeing how inflammation is affecting things like premature aging, which is really interesting. But it doesn't stop there. We're also seeing how your other systems in the body, inflammation can also trigger our nervous system. So when we think about our skin is incredible. It's the largest organ of the body, and we take it for granted sometimes because it works without us having to think about it. But it's much more than just a barrier between you and the outside world. Have you ever noticed, I think actually some of you have maybe mentioned this already, but have you noticed that you struggle with your skin when you're stressed? I know that personally I do. When I become stressed, the first area I see it is on my skin in the form of breakout activity. And I'm sure lots of you on the webinar with me today can also relate to that. And that's because our skin is closely connected to our nervous system and our brain. And it's connected via the nerves in our skin. So let's just remind ourselves, what does our nervous system do? Our nervous system allows us to sense touch, temperature, and respond accordingly. Your nerves will send messages to your brain via your nerve endings in the skin. So if you were to touch your skin now, the nerves in your skin send that message to your brain to recognize that sensation of touch and the temperature of your other hand. I'd like you to think about, when you've got a client on the bed in the treatment room, when you put a cold compress on the skin, this has an immediate reaction or response for that client, especially if that client's hot, it will give them that immediate relief. And this is due to the nerves in the skin sending the messages to the brain to tell them about that change in temperature. So it shows how responsive your skin is. It shows how closely connected we are to our nerves and our nerve responses. And this diagram illustrates here the relationship between our nerves and the surface of the skin. So when we have, things coming into contact with the skin, cold, heat, pH change, or mechanical friction, we're stimulating a nerve response that's actually, playing a role with our nerve endings. So, this process and this nerve response, and talking about the nervous system, we will refer to as neurogenic inflammation. So when neurogenic means related to the nervous system, which as we know is controlled by the brain. So if you do have a client on the bed who is sensitive, it's now no surprise to you that they might be on hyper alert, or they might be feeling things, or might be responsive, or the skin might be going red. That now tells you that this might be an indicator that the nerves are on hyper alert. So we mentioned feeling stressed, and when we're stressed, one of you mentioned you notice around your eyes become problematic. And that's showing us that stress can increase that nerve activity, and it can have an effect on sensitivity on the skin. So you might be using an exfoliation in the treatment room that, you know, is normally okay on your client's skin, but today their stress levels are particularly high and they're not able to tolerate that exfoliation today. It's tingling more than it would normally, and there's discomfort there. And that's due to the sensitized nerve endings. Some individuals will have naturally overactive skin nerves, making them more intolerant or sensitive to perhaps normal things that we're used to doing. So the immune system talks to the nervous system, and it's all very closely connected. And this explains, you know, skin sensitivity and how the nerves play a role in that. So we're going to look at the process of neurogenic inflammation here. And you can see that when stressed, our nervous system is activated, and that triggers neuropeptides. And neuropeptide language communicates between our central nervous system and our skin immune system. And we see a release of neuropeptides which trigger inflammation. Neuropeptides you can see on the slide here, known as CGRP and substance P. These neuropeptides activate the mast cell to release histamine. And the cascade of events triggered is the same as we previously discussed. So the immune cells now come into action and they release inflammatory cytokines which amplify the inflammatory response on the skin. So the Langerhans cells in the epidermis are activated, and that continues the inflammatory process of the skin. So we see redness, irritation, flare up, and maybe itching. So as a summary here, we have seen that immunogenic inflammation is triggered by a local response due to something like an allergen or invading bacteria or just something in our day-to-day life. And we now see that our nervous system is also in action, and stress can trigger this neurogenic inflammation response by releasing neuropeptides that result in an inflammatory cascade of events. Have you ever noticed that when you have inflammation on your skin, you are left with a post-inflammatory mark? I know when I suffered with breakout activity on my skin, I was left with those post-inflammatory breakout marks on my skin. And this is because we don't just have neuropeptides that trigger inflammation. We also have neuropeptides that act as anti-inflammatories. So you can see on the screen here, I've shared with you the role of alpha MSH. And the reason that I wanted to point this out was because alpha MSH is one of those neuropeptides that acts as an anti-inflammatory, and it stands for alpha melanin stimulating hormone. So it releases melanin, and melanin acts as the anti-inflammatory in this process of the response. So that's why you see the marking left over on the skin. And some of you have shared with me in the chat function that you get these breakout marks all the time, and that's now helping you understand that it's where you've had the inflammation on the skin. Post that inflammation, you will start to see that mark left over because it's part of the healing process. So, you know, hugely eye-opening, very, very interesting, and I appreciate we're covering a lot of information today, so I do hope you're still with me. But in summary, I wanted to share with you that I can repeat what alpha MSH was. I've just noticed that question come up in the chat function. Alpha MSH is alpha melanin stimulating hormone, and it's the anti-inflammatory in this process. So we've discussed the inflammatory process in the body. This here now shows you a diagram of inflammation in the skin. And this highlights the key players in inflammation. You know, we've talked about the brain, we've talked about how there's different cells involved and different processes involved. And I think this really sort of highlights to us how complex the process of inflammation is within the skin. And now maybe you're starting to see why it can be one of the more challenging conditions for us as professional skin therapists to treat, because there is so much involved in this process. So I think talking of that and how complex it is, we want to feel confident in treating it. And now it's time to step into looking at our treatment approach. As a professional skin therapist, we can reduce inflammation that we see on the skin. We can help the body curb the inflammatory response by using anti-inflammatory ingredients, which I'm going to introduce you to in a moment. But we can also bring an anti-inflammatory effect from different parts of our lifestyle as well, through, choices that we make. We can control neurogenic inflammation, and I find this so exciting because, having discussed the neurogenic inflammation process with you just now, I think it's uber exciting to share with you that we can use ingredients that target neurogenic inflammation and sensitivity to help support the skin's threshold. We can reinforce the epidermal barrier, and this is essential to our support of the skin. It's going to prevent you going into an inflammatory response or an inflammatory state. If you have a good epidermal barrier, you're going to be less likely to have troublesome inflammatory flare-ups like breakouts and eczema on the skin. And finally, we can reduce stress. And this is where you as the professional skin therapist is so important. We have the power of touch to use our stress relieving techniques that can stop the cycle from continuing. We said that inflammation was good because we know it defends and it protects, but it's when it starts to go into overdrive that this can, really cause a problem. So these stress relieving techniques are so important. Our touch can really calm and reduce stress for our clients. So I'd like us to look in a little bit more detail now so that you leave the session feeling confident in the different ways that you can do all of this. So one of the ways is with our ingredient technology, and I know lots of you will ask me questions about what ingredients should I use on my skin, what ingredients should I avoid, and these here on the screen with you today are a list of anti-inflammatory ingredients. Now, this isn't comprehensive of every anti-inflammatory ingredient out there. I couldn't get them all on the screen today, but I think it just highlights for you some of the key ones to look out for. So please feel free to take a screenshot of these ingredients. We have oats. Oats have a calming and soothing effect on the skin. They're an anti-irritant and they reduce redness and itching. You'll be maybe familiar with chamomile and white tea and green tea. Those ingredients are fantastic for calming and reducing sensitivity. So we use chamomile to reduce edema and sensitivity. Ginger, I think this is always a bit of an eye-opening one for lots of you. Ginger reduces inflammation on the skin, and I think outside of the box, because if ginger can be used as an ingredient within our skincare ingredients, think about how you can integrate ginger into your lifestyle in a variety of different ways. And I know we can't tell clients what to eat or drink, but we know that we can add ginger into our diet to have that anti-inflammatory diet as well, which is really exciting. So licorice, we know, has that anti-inflammatory and antioxidant benefit, and those soothing and antiseptic properties from lavender. Not only that, I also mentioned that we could limit and control neurogenic inflammation. And these ingredients here on the screen for you now show you that we can use acetyl tetrapeptide 15 to decrease the release of pro-inflammatory neuropeptides like CGRP. And the acetyl tetrapeptide raises your skin's threshold. So you'll remember at the beginning I mentioned to you that your skin has a threshold, and it's the acetyl tetrapeptide that will support your skin's threshold so it can cope better. Palmitoyl tripeptide is a fantastic ingredient that mimics the alpha MSH hormone to help your skin inflammatory reactions. So look out for these ingredients, to really provide soothing and calming effects on the neurogenic inflammation. And finally, we know that it's fundamental to support the barrier function of your skin. So barrier repairing ingredients that are listed here: evening primrose oil, borage seed oil, sunflower seed extract, and oils. These are all going to mimic the natural lipids within your skin's barrier. So you have lots of lipids that are supporting supporting your skin, and these ingredients will support those lipids. So when we say to you we need to support the barrier, we need to be replenishing with these kind of ingredients to really fill in those gaps of that compromised barrier. And, you know, I think the power of Pro Skin is not to be underestimated. Us as professional skin therapists have the opportunity to take our treatment approach to suit a sensitive skin, and we must follow the less rules. So you'll see here we're sharing with you less friction, less heat, less time, and less product. So when it comes to less friction, we want to be, you know, gently cleansing the skin, avoiding high foam that's going to remove the skin lipids, avoid scrubs. You know, when we say friction, well, what is that? You know, avoid manually scrubbing and irritating the skin. Avoid maybe a European style massage that can be overstimulating and increase circulation. Use a pressure point massage to press and release. And I like to speak from experience that when I have the pressure point massage on my own skin, I physically see the inflammation on my skin has reduced. Less heat, less steam in the treatment room. We often use steam in our skin treatments, but don't use steam if you've got a sensitive skin. Don't use warm water, and, you know, opt for cool towels, cool compressors, and also think about, you know, cooling stones or cooling technology that you can use on the skin. Think about less time. Don't leave products on for long periods of time. Maybe opt for a shorter service if you've got a new nervous sensitive client. Sensitive skins are often nervous to come in and seek advice because their skin is so reactive. And then finally, less product. Don't use too much variety. Don't try and be over ambitious with ingredient technology. Just keep it to the basics, and less is more. And finally, making sure that we advise our clients to look after their skin at home. And I think now more than ever, with the current circumstances that we find ourselves in, it's really important to bring our education for at-home skincare to the forefront, because lots of clients are managing their sensitive skin at home at the moment. So, you know, tell them to avoid the triggers, avoid those tripwires, maybe encourage them to keep a trigger diary to see what's irritating them, avoid extreme temperatures where possible, avoid over-exfoliation, avoid skincare products that contain SD alcohol, artificial colour, artificial fragrance. It's important to encourage them to be gentle on the skin, making sure that they use a soft cloth, no buffing of the skin, no scrubs. Try and avoid rubbing the skin when you cleanse, and avoid towels. Some of these small nuggets of information are the most useful and have the most benefit on the skin. We have spritzing toners that will be less irritating because we don't have to apply them to the skin with a cotton round. Encouraging the client to understand how to repair the skin's barrier, making sure that they moisturize and hydrate to replenish those lost lipids, replenish those ceramides within the skin. And, you know, cooling and calming is really, really important. And finally, making sure that, you know, they're protecting from the outside world. We can't necessarily always avoid it, so protect with a UV, making sure that you're able to have that barrier sunblock on the skin, which will support your skin's barrier. So finally, I wanted to finish you know, really giving you the confidence to educate your clients at home and extend your knowledge to your clients. I really feel that we are surrounded by a crowded marketplace now more than ever. We know that consumer behavior is shifting drastically at the moment, particularly with COVID-19, and we need to move with this shift and really help our clients not feel confused with what's out there on the market, but give them sound advice and teach them about the specialized ingredients that we have to reduce the inflammatory process in the skin. Remember that knowledge is power, so smartening up is the way to win your clients' trust. And, you know, let's not see sensitivity as a weakness, but see it as a sign of strength. And it's been fantastic to share all of these insights with you today. And I hope you've been able to take away some key information that can give you confidence to give your clients the skin confidence that they're looking for. So thank you for today. And I'm going to hand back over to Beth, who I think will perhaps host some Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jessica. We really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Again, Jessica Barber. She is our international senior training specialist for the UK. And so she comes to this webinar today bringing a vast amount of knowledge. I'm sure a lot of you agree. You probably learned more than you ever thought about the immune system, immunogenic inflammation, and neurogenic inflammation. So we loved it, Jessica. I mean, the comments are just flooding in on that chat box today. So we appreciate you joining us.
I'm loving the comments. Thank you, everybody.
So good. We do have time for a few questions. I think one here, Jessica, talks a little bit about, capillaries in the skin. And we know that, especially with like rosacea, more sensitive skin, and that can be a little bit more apparent. So the question is, why do these, capillaries tend to dilate, or why do we see them a little bit more in a sensitive skin, such as like rosacea would be a good example?
Yeah, so with those types of skins, you tend to find that they are, they're more reactive. The capillary activity is part of the genetic makeup, I'm afraid, and the capillary activity is naturally more reactive and more responsive.
Mm-hmm. Right, and especially I think too, just being so close to the surface of the skin, you're going to see that, right? When you see that flushing, or those capillaries become a little bit more, engorged with a blood flow, or they've become kind of distended as well, just from the, overactivity in the skin. So, okay, perfect. A lot of that flushing and blushing that we can definitely see. The other question was, there was some great information that, and I'm kind of going back through all of our questions here. There was some great information around ingredients that you were sharing with us today. And there was a question, someone wanted to just see if you had a little bit more information that I know you kind of went through it on some of the top ones as well, around, I believe it was around the second ingredient. So you had the anti-inflammatory ingredients, and then you had 2 additional slides about those ingredients as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to see, there we go.
You want to see the slide again?
Repairing ingredients. So with that, I think there were some people who wanted to see that just one more time.
Did you say the barrier repairing ingredient slide?
There we go. Yes, perfect. Could you share a little bit more information about why it's important to have that healthy barrier when it comes to sensitized skin?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. So, when we think about the barrier of the skin, we talked about having the skin cells, which are like the bricks. We've got the lipids which surround those skin cells, they're the cement, and that holds everything together. And I think when it comes to a sensitive skin, you often find that they're lacking in those lipids already. So they're on the back foot. So it's important that we are replenishing the skin actively with lipid ingredients. And these ingredients here are those barrier repairing oils that are really going to replenish the ceramides that make up that lipid barrier, to really help replenish that skin barrier. Does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's perfect. I think it's just kind of explaining that about the lipids, and of course these barrier repairing ingredients being able to help with that kind of missing component or the impaired component on the skin, and when it comes to having a healthy skin barrier. We also have another question popped up, again about the alpha MSH. So if you could maybe just repeat that one more time. There's a couple questions around that, just again what it stands for and what it is.
Yep, so alpha MSH stands for alpha melanin stimulating hormone, and it's a neuropeptide, and it's a neuropeptide that has an anti-inflammatory action. So it's able to stop the kind of inflammation. It's there to stop the inflammatory process that's taking place on the skin. So we talked about the neuropeptides like CGRP and substance P, which have a pro-inflammatory response, have a pro-inflammatory action. CGRP is sort of high in levels with people that suffer with migraine. It's a real pro-inflammatory neuropeptide, whereas the alpha MSH, which is the alpha melanin stimulating hormone, is an anti-inflammatory. So it comes in and acts as an anti-inflammatory to try and stop the inflammation on the skin.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, I think that is all the time we have for today. Again, thank you so much to Jessica for being here with us for the Dermal Institute Industry Expert Webinar Series. We hope that everyone's enjoyed your time here. Again, stay tuned. We always have a featured guest speaker every month around a key hot topic that is important to our industry. And Jessica, I know from myself, the International Dermal Institute, and all the students and attendees who are tuning in today, just a big heartfelt thank you for sharing your knowledge and being here today as our industry expert. We really appreciate you.
That's no problem. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a privilege to be here. So thank you very much. And thank you all for tuning in.